So as far as the presentation goes, I'm going to be focusing on the first part of this around various annotation techniques within charts. Annotations are an important part of telling the story behind your data, so I want to show you some of the more interesting features in that space. Then we'll shift into how to create specific chart types, like a Gantt chart. It's not a native chart to Excel, but it's actually not too bad in terms of building one out using basic building blocks within the various features. Then we'll show you how to create reference lines and banded regions, and then we'll conclude with conditional formatting. And the way I've structured this is we start out fairly basic, and we grow in terms of complexity in terms of building these, okay? So I'll go slow in some of these parts. Just so you know, though, I've included steps for everything I'm doing in the slides, as well as a workbook that I'll include as part of the conference material. So you don't have to worry about taking notes and remembering exactly every detail that I mentioned. Just kind of sit back, absorb it, and enjoy, okay? All right, yes. Okay, one of the things I want to convey is that Excel has a tremendous amount of power as well as flexibility. Really, your creativity is the only thing that limits you with respect to whatever you want to do. Some of these things you might not think of doing, but I'll show you some of the techniques and tricks for doing that. So for example, if you want to create a new chart type, like a Maremenko chart, you can actually do that within Excel. It's not terribly straightforward, but you can do that. There are several steps involved with some of these techniques. And some of you, after you see these steps, will think to yourself, Scott, that seems like a lot of work to do these types of things. Why is it so hard? Once you do it a few times, it's actually not so bad. But I do want to reassure you that we do get it. We don't want to make this difficult. This is a tips and tricks session to show you some of the power and flexibility, but we are really trying to work on simplifying the user experience and providing you native capabilities so that you don't have to go through 7, 10, 15 steps to create a basic chart. If some of you attended my presentation yesterday, where I talked about some of the new visualization types like box and whisker, histogram, waterfall, now you can create those within 2 clicks. That's not the case with some of the things I'm going to show you today, but we are working towards that plan, essentially, okay? The other good news with this, what I'm going to show you today won't require any code, so you don't have to worry about learning VBA or anything of that nature. And the nice thing about that as well is that these solutions that I'll show you can be run on largely any of the endpoints, be it the web, be it Universal or Android, things like that, because they don't have any external requirements. They're just using core functionality of Excel, such as formulas and functions, stuff of that nature. The solutions I'll show you are dynamic, so they will respond to data change events. And they are still just normal charts. So they respect theme changes, styling changes, things like that, so that you don't have to worry about any oddball behavior as you work with them, because they are just charts, okay? So the bulk of this presentation will be in the demo of my workbook here. So I'm going to switch over to that. And as I said, we're going to start off fairly basic and build up the complexity as we move along. And if you have any questions, please just raise your hand, stop me, ask, and we'll go into it. In fact, we've got some swag here for anybody who asks a question. I'll give you a free book to take back with you. All right. Okay, so we're going to focus on annotations of our chart as a starting point. And the thing that we're going to strive for is, this is the end product that we're shooting for right here, where we want to label one data point with some very specific information. A lot of times this is important to call out aspects of the data set that you want someone to take note of. All right, so that's the first one we're going to work on. We'll go back to our original data set here, and we're going to create a basic column chart. Go up to the Insert menu, and nothing too exciting about that. But the guy that we're going to be working with is this chocolates column here. So I'm going to get rid of this title for a moment. Doesn't need any extra emphasis on that. So a feature we added in Excel 2013 was this ability to create callouts for particular data points. So what I did was I first clicked to select the series, and then I'm going to click again to select this individual data point, right-click, and then go down to, let me get down to this here real quick. Add data label, and then this item called Add Data Callout. When I select that, we put a default callout on here, which gives you the label of the data point as well as its value. But I'm going to change it a little bit. So I'll select this guy and move him off to the side here. And I'll stretch him out a little bit. And the nice thing with these callouts is you can pretty much put whatever information in here that you want. So, for example, if I want to label this as best product, and we'll highlight that guy. And then if I wanted to add additional details to this, such as I want to pull in the profit for that particular thing, I could put another label in here, call it profit. And I want this to be data bound. I could type that value in there, but that kind of defeats the purpose. So what I'll do again is I'll right click on this, and I'll go down to the item we call Insert Data Label Field. And that allows me to select from a series of predefined values, such as the value, series, and category. Those aren't the ones that I'm looking for. The one that I'm after is choose from cell. When I select that, it brings up a little dialog here, and now I can pick any cell to bind to a particular field in my callout. So in this case, I want the chocolate. So I'll go ahead and select that guy and insert him. So you can see now I have 60 represented in there that is bound to my data set. And if let's get out of this view here. If I change this value, let's say it's 200 now, that will automatically update, okay? So again, that's a feature within Excel 2013 that we allow you to basically bind to data in various fields and add these callouts. Now, if I want to dress this up a little bit more, I can change the formatting of it. I'm going to double click on this callout, which will bring up our formatting object task pane. Yes?
Is there a way that you could have, instead of having to select the cell, that it could look at the column name and find it in the chart so that you didn't have to?
Like a VLOOKUP?
So that it would know, okay, we want chocolate, and it would pull in the profit.
We don't support that. It's a direct cell reference that we support in the callout feature, okay? Sure.
Is there a way to set that automatic? So, for example, I want the call to be dynamic, finding the maximum column. Can you set it up? Because it's a dynamic.
Yeah, so in that case, you'd have to create a formula in a cell that finds the maximum value of the values that you're looking in, and then bind to that particular cell that has the formula in it, okay? So there's a few tricks you can play with the formulas, and I'll show you some other examples of that as we move it through this. All right, we're going to change the formatting of this to dress it up a little bit here. Change the fill to, let's say, a gradient fill. Makes it match the series a little bit better. So there you have it. There's our first call out, annotating a particular data point and providing additional information. Yes? Is there a way to add columns? I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear your question. Yes. Oh, so what you, I think, are asking for what we refer to as data labels. So I can select my series and add data labels, which you can then specify various values. Is that what you're after? Okay. So yes, the callout is specifically for a single data point. The nature of the name is callout, so you're calling out a specific thing in that case. If you want to label all the data points, that's a data label, essentially. All right? Let me move on to my next example. I'm going to get rid of this guy. And we're going to create a scatter chart. So sales versus profit. Scatter chart. Now, this is a fine-looking scatter chart. However, what we get asked quite a bit is, what do all those dots mean? I mean, I need some reference back to the actual labels that they refer to. I don't know what product the particular data points refer to. So what I'm going to do is create labels for each of these guys. Let me get out of this real quick. So I'm going to add data labels to all of the points. But now I need to modify these data labels. They are giving me the value axis, the vertical axis value, which arguably isn't terribly useful because it's already there. You can just scan across to the left. So what I'm going to do is select these guys, go over to my Format Object Task pane, and you notice there's a variety of different options for us. The thing that I'm going to do is go value from cells. First, I'm going to turn off the Y value. Again, that wasn't useful. But I'm going to go value from cells. When I click that, it brings up a dialog that allows me to select the range of labels that I'll be using for those data labels, and I'll apply them, okay? So now we have nicely labeled scatter chart. I can stretch that out a little bit, and then I can move individual items if there's some occlusion, and you can see that more clearly. So there you have it, okay? So it's a very convenient way of labeling your scatter charts. aren't labeled automatically. I could add those as part of the chart elements. I just skipped over that step in the spirit of time expediency, but I can add those to the chart elements. We are also working on better defaults. So one of the concerns that people have expressed to us is, hey, why do you make me work so hard to make this look like a professional chart or a chart that uses best practices? We get it. We totally understand the point. And we are working on having better defaults so that you don't have to remember all these steps to get basic things on your chart. Scatter charts are a good example of that. All right, let's move on to another example here. There are times when people want a pretty basic looking chart where they strip away all the noise. They get rid of the grid lines, they get rid of the value axis, things like that. They just want a kind of simple presentation of their chart for a report or something of that nature. So here I have a chart where I've done essentially all of that, and it's basically a stacked column chart, and I have an aggregation of the bars sitting on the top. So basically giving you the totals of those columns, and then I can kind of visually see which is sales in the east greater than sales on the west, but it's more of a ballparking of that. I think of it kind of like a pie chart, but in a bar chart form, okay? So I'll show you how to create this particular chart. All right, first thing we're going to do is create our base chart. And again, this is a stacked column chart. Stretch him out a little bit. Get rid of a few things here. Okay, now to get the aggregation of these columns, I need to add a new column to my data set. So we're going to call this sum. And because my chart is bound to a table, it automatically will add these values to the chart. I don't have to manually do that. All right, so I'll go ahead and hit equal here. We're going to add the sum of the east plus sum of the west. And it'll fill down, which is the normal behavior of the table. And as I said before, the table is bound to the chart, so it adds it automatically. Now, these are gray bars here, not terribly appealing, but we're going to use them as a way of putting on a label at the top. Okay, so I'll go ahead and add my data labels, and I'll bring up the format task pane for these things. What I'd like to do is show them on the inside base to get them closer to the top edge of the other bars. Okay, let's hide this guy for a moment. Actually, no, what I'll do is I'd like to now get rid of the gray bars themselves. And this is a very common technique. What we're doing here is essentially using this additional series as a placeholder so that we could draw other things on the chart. In this case, we're going to essentially put labels on the chart being controlled by this. We call it phantom series or dummy series, things that are just behind the scenes that allow us to control through data the drawing of these things. So we essentially want to get rid of the actual look of the bar. So we're going to go no fill on these things, which essentially hides them. Okay? Now we can start to clean up our chart a bit. We'll get rid of the grid lines. This value axis is pretty tall because we added that extra series. If you know your values aren't going to go much higher than, let's say, 1,000, I can dial that in a little bit more. I can go to my axis options and change the maximum to, let's say, 1,000, which will increase the size of the bars, draw more attention to them. Now that I've done that, I'd like to clean up my legend. You see this sum, I can click into the legend and select that and then hit the delete key to remove it. So we get rid of that phantom series. And now I can actually get rid of the value axis. I'll hit the delete key on that. And there you have it, a nicely formatted chart with all the noise removed from it. Okay? All right, let's move on to our next one here. All right, next up is creation of a Gantt chart. Gantt charts are a very popular chart type in Excel. People use Excel all the time for doing project management, things of that nature. You'll need to lay out your data in this format where I've got task, start date, and duration, which is the basis of most Gantt charts. And then we'll be able to create a Gantt chart similar to this. Okay? All right. As I mentioned before, we're going to start to increase the complexity a little bit with these. And with this particular one, I could start off with creating a horizontal bar chart or stacked bar chart like this, but it's kind of a mess. It's not even close to where I want to end up. And you'll actually wind up spending more time rejiggering this particular one than just starting from scratch. So that's what I'm going to do, is basically start with a blank chart and build it up from its constituent pieces. Let's go and create our stacked bar chart here. It's blank. And now I'm going to add in the series that I want to build this thing up. And the way I do that is by going to the Select Data dialog. Now, some people are a little intimidated by this dialog. There's a lot going on in this space, but it's doing some basic things in that it allows me to work with my series, which is the left-hand side of the dialog, and then work with my category, which is the horizontal axis, or in this case, the vertical axis, and those labels. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add a series to the chart. We'll click the Add button. It brings up a dialog where the first item it's asking for is the series name, which will be the start date. We'll select that. And then I'm going to select the series value. And you can see it's starting to build up the chart behind the scenes. Click OK. And so you can see now I've got a start date that's been added as a series. And then it added in some default values for the horizontal or category axis. We'll work with that here in a second. Now I want to add the duration. So I'll go ahead and add another series. Select the duration cell. And then add its values. And you can see those are the actual floating bars that we're going to have in our Gantt chart. So we're starting to take shape. It takes a little bit of time, but it's starting to take shape. Now let's do something about these values here, the 1, 2, 3, 4. That's just the default stuff that we throw on a chart if you haven't specified the values for your category axis. So let's go ahead and fix that. We'll click the Edit. And again, it brings up a dialog that allows me to specify the range that defines those labels. So I'll go ahead and select my tasks. And now I actually have something that's starting to look more like a Gantt chart. If you look closely, though, let me expand this guy, you'll notice that the labels are in reverse order. So for example, I've got customer research at the top for my top task, and it's at the bottom of the chart. Don't really like that. I actually want the chart to reflect the data structure as best it can. So what I'm going to do here is bring up the Format Object Task pane again, and I'm going to go to an option under Axis Options called Categories in Reverse Order. Okay? I'm going to click that guy. Yeah, sometimes the screen gets locked with the zooming capability. Go back to here. I'm going to click this guy, and it's going to flip the categories. So now they match those in the actual grid. And it also moved the dates to the top of the chart. So that's just a technique that you can use for this particular purpose. OK, now I don't really like my bars sitting out here in space. I want to move them right next to the edge of my axis because that's the beginning of my project. So my project starts on 1/1/2016. So let's go ahead and see what we can do about that. So I'll double click on this again to bring up the Format Object Task pane for my axis options. And let's take a look at the min and the max values. You look in here and say, there's some odd numbers in this area. It's like, what is that? Well, that is a reflection of the fact that this axis here is actually a value axis. It's not a date axis. It looks like a date axis, but that's only because the values are formatted as a date. Okay? In Excel, we don't have strong data typings. This is kind of one of the artifacts of that situation. However, we can still work with this. This number represents the number of days since the beginning of January 1st, 1900. Okay? Now, you may be thinking in your head, like, all right, how am I going to figure that out for just January 1st, 2016? It's not something you just kind of know off the top of your head. But here's a really good technique. All you need to do is type the actual date in this field, and we will automatically do the calculation for you. Okay? Granted, not terribly obvious, but it works just fine. You can also type in the value if you know the number of days as well. Okay, so we now have our Gantt chart starting to take shape here. Let's get rid of these blue bars. This is a technique that I showed you earlier with the previous example where I click on the fill bucket and I go to no fill. And essentially, that is our Gantt chart. Okay? The good thing about this is it's all data bound, so if any of these values change, like say the competitive research takes a little longer than anticipated, it dynamically updates. You can create a template out of these things and reuse them, just changing the data. So it may take a little bit setting this up initially, but you can reuse it time and time again just by changing the underlying data. Okay? I'm sorry? Can you add a new row? You can, but because this is not a table, if we're a table, it would automatically add it to the chart. This is just a straight range, so I would have to manually add that value or extend my range to the select data dialog. But it's entirely possible. Yes? Yep, yep. Great question. In fact, that's a perfect segue into my next topic, which is on reference lines and banded regions. So you get one of these books afterwards, okay? Thank you. Okay, so reference lines and banded regions. This is another commonly requested feature in Excel. And as I said, we do get it. We understand the importance and value of these things. In fact, we are working on designs to deliver this as a native capability as I speak. But in the meantime, there are some techniques you can use to get around the limitation today. And in fact, in some ways, the plus side of some of these techniques is the thing I'll show you here actually works in many versions of the past. So these techniques will work all the way back to Excel 2007. Okay, so if you're in an older version of Excel, you can still use these techniques. All right, so what we're looking at here are a number of reference lines and banded regions. And you can imagine a scenario where, let's say you have a manufacturing process where you're monitoring the weight of things coming off an assembly line. So let's say you're making pen barrels, something of that nature. You don't want to put too much material into the pen because that's just a waste of money. And you don't want too little material to go into the pen because it'll be fragile and it can break, something like that. So what you want to do is monitor by taking various samples at various times to make sure that you're in compliance with this target zone, okay? And you can establish what the danger zone is or the best zone for you to be operating in. So you can apply this to manufacturing processes. You could apply this to maybe your finances, tracking those over date and time. It could be your blood pressure, a wide variety of different scenarios in that space. So let's go ahead and build up this chart. First off, you're going to want to lay out your data in a format similar to the way I have it here in the grid. So we have your primary measure here that we'll actually create our first line chart with. So we'll go ahead and select that and insert a line chart. So that's our base chart we'll work with. Then you want to set up your thresholds of lower bound, target, and upper bound, essentially to the right of your data set. These thresholds, as you can see, are all the same value. And again, we're going to be using this technique of a phantom series or a dummy series to essentially paint something on the chart that we can then control through data. Okay. Now, let's stretch this guy out a little bit. And I'm going to put a few labels on them just so we're clear on what the various things are. So this was weight. And this was sample. All right. Now, a moment ago, I showed you how to add series to the chart through the Select Data dialog. That's certainly a good approach. There's a lot going on in that dialog. So if you don't want to mess with some of the complexity in that dialog, there's actually a faster way of doing that. And it simply involves selecting the entire column, copying it, and pasting it into the chart. As you can see, that's my first threshold of the lower bound. I just added that series to it. If I go into the Select Data dialog, you'll notice that it adds it as this particular series. Okay? So again, if you don't want to deal with the Select Data dialog, you can just simply copy in the column of data directly into your chart. So I'm going to go ahead and do that for my lower bound, target, and upper bound values. Okay. We now have our three thresholds. Now what I'd like to do is actually put some banded regions in here to draw attention to the particular zone that I want to stay within for the particular process that I'm monitoring. So we're going to select the first lower bound. We're going to add a chart element to this, which may not necessarily be obvious right off the bat, but it actually has some pretty cool capabilities beyond what its intended purpose was. And what we're going to do is add an error bar or error bars to that particular line. And we're going to set some of the properties on this by opening the Format Object Task pane. Let me move this guy off to the right so you can see him a little better. So what we're going to do is add a band that's below this particular line. So we can select that guy again. And I've got to get my error bars back. Options. Okay. What we want is the direction to be in the negative direction. So we can have positive, negative, or both. Let's go minus on that. We don't need an end cap. That's a little hash mark at the top. And we want to change the fixed value, that being the height of the error bar, to something that is respective of the band that we want to create here. So I'll hit Tab, and now we can actually see the beginnings of that region take place. We're going to need to change the formatting on this so that it actually looks like a banded region, not just a bunch of lines. So we'll go over to the paint bucket here. We'll have let's go with a yellow fill. And we're going to make it nice and thick so that it fills up that entire region. Okay? So essentially, we're just looking at error bars that have a very wide width to them. Let's tone down this particular reference line so that it doesn't stand out so much. We'll go with kind of a charcoal look and make the line thickness a little bit thinner on that. We're going to do a rinse and repeat on the other two reference lines now. So let's look at our target line here. We're going to add error bars to that guy. And in this case, we want both the positive and negative direction for that error bar. We don't want an end cap. We're going to set the value to 20 above and below that particular point. Change the formatting on it once again to it's a good section of the chart to be in, and we'll increase the width. Okay? Now, we don't really need this center line, so we're going to use one of our techniques before, as we were showing. We're going to just get rid of that line so it doesn't appear in the chart. And we're going to do the same thing to this top reference line here. We're going to add error bars like we were doing before. We'll go back to more options. This time we want these to go in the positive direction, no end cap, fixed width of 20. And we have the formation of that. Now let's set the formatting once again to a red color. I don't really like these reds, so I'm going to go to more colors, give it a little bit nicer looking red. Something that's not too overbearing. And we're going to set the thickness to 20 pixels. All right. Let's tone this guy down a little bit. Make him a little bit thinner. And there we have the basics of our banded regions and reference lines. Now, there's a little bit more cleanup work we can do in this space. If we know our chart's not really ever going to go above 140 or below 60, I can restrict the min and max on my value axis. I'll double click on the value axis, bring up the axis options. We'll set the min to 60 and the max to 140. We'll tighten up that range a little bit. And what's also nice about these reference lines is, again, they're just series. So we can add any other chart elements to them that we would like. Earlier, I showed you how to add a call out to a particular data point. So effectively, this is a data point. So if I want to add a call out to that, I'll right-click, go down to Add Data Callout, and now I can put a specific label on that threshold that is a little bit more meaningful than these values here. We'll call this Danger Zone. All right. So there you have it, reference lines and banded regions. Yes?
So for the center one, you had that fixed 20?
Yep.
What if those other two reference lines vary?
If the other two reference lines vary, you can change the values, that the thresholds. Back in the grid here, we can change these values here to change those thresholds, if that answers your question.
Right, so like highlighted region is plus or minus 20?
Yes.
Around that little line?
Yep.
So if one of the other bounds come into it, does it still highlight the 20 above?
It would. So the question is basically, would the upper and lower bounds still highlight just that fixed range? They would, and so that means you would have to manually go in and change those unless there's some way you can dynamically change them in the grid through formulas. Okay. Another question, yes? Can you use a formula to set the min and max on the axis? The answer to that is no. However, that is a very highly requested feature, and we actually are spinning up plans to implement that capability in another release in the future. So yes, that would be awesome. And we want to take it beyond just the value axis. We want to actually allow you to bind properties of any nature in the chart to the grid. So that's something that we are definitely planning on doing as well. Okay? All right, let me move on to the grand finale, which is conditional formatting. And then I'm going to turn over to Frank to show you some of the Visio visualization. I'm sorry, do you have a question? I'm sorry, couldn't hear that last part.
Could you not use a zone chart, like use series and create a zone chart?
Could you use series to create a zone chart? Depends upon, yeah. So there's some limitations to what you can achieve with the technique that I showed you a moment ago. The technique works for kind of rectangular regions and rectangular zones. If you have a free-form zone, this technique probably will not work for you. But there's other approaches we could take. In fact, afterwards, I can talk to you about some of those other techniques. Okay? All right. As I was saying, this is kind of the grand finale. This is where the complexity is a little bit higher. But it's actually one of the more interesting chart types that you can create within Excel. So what we have here is a basic chart showing sales of various products. The height of the bars represent the sales, but the color of the bars represents the profitability. So effectively, we're exposing another dimension of data through color. So it's conditional formatting on a chart. This is useful in situations where you want to call out outliers. So as an example, here we have chocolate. It has high sales, high profitability. Not super interesting. That's all good and well. But we have another product, syrup, which has high sales but low profitability based on the color. You can see that right off the bat. So this is something you actually may want to check into to improve your operations. Here's another case where we have dried pears, which has low sales but high profitability. So maybe that's a case where you want to increase the amount of sales through some other mechanism to take advantage of that high profitable product. Okay? So very useful chart type. Let me show you how to build this up. First off, we'll start out with our data set here. And what I'm going to do is create 2 rows to define the bins for my coloring. I'm going to cheat a little bit here and copy paste these values so you don't have to watch me type them in. All right, and then I'm going to also create headers for these. All right, okay. Let's go ahead and create our first chart, the base chart. We'll insert a column chart. Stretch that out a little bit. We don't need this guy right now. Okay. Now what we'd like to do is control the color of each of these bars independent of one another. We're dealing with a single series chart, which by definition has a single color. So effectively what we need to do is split this single series chart up into multiple series. We're going to effectively create 5 different series that all look like one series, but that allows us to control the color independent of each other. So the way I'm going to do that is change the data binding in my table here. As you can see, when the chart is selected, we have these colored regions. These are called foils. I can actually drag those to different parts of my data range. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this and drag it to this first column. That blanks out the data in my chart because there's nothing there yet. And then I expand this across the 5 different bins, effectively, that we're going to populate here in a moment. Okay? Now, the concept here, it takes a little bit of getting used to, but the idea is as I put values into these cells, those will start to show up in the chart. But if I put them in different columns, they will effectively be different series. There'll be 5 series in total when it's all said and done. So as an example, I'm just going to go ahead and type in 2,250 into this, and the bar shows up in my chart. Okay? Sure. Could you repeat the first part of that? I couldn't hear it.
So I still see the values in the same column.
Yep.
So you drag something and the chart became empty. I didn't get that.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, let me repeat that step because this is an important part of the process. This is all called out in the steps in the slide deck, but it's useful to see it in person. So I'm going to select the chart, and the chart essentially then shows you where the data is that's bound to the chart through these foiled references. The category axis is defined here on the left-hand side. You can see those. And the actual series are defined by this header row and these. So I'll reverse it back to the way it was originally. The trick here is that a lot of people don't realize you can drag these things around. So you can change the specification of the data binding of the chart to the data range. That's the trick. So I'm going to hover over this right edge. You can see how my mouse, the crosshairs, turn to that kind of grabby thing, and I'm going to drag that to a different location. Okay, that's the trick. And then I can also expand it by coming up to this lower right edge here and drag that across to define that I'm going to be using this block from D3 through H15 as my range of values that I'm going to specify for my chart. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so I just typed in 2250 for this first one. If I put in, let's say, 700 for beer, you'll notice that another series shows up on my chart, but in a different color. So that's the whole key part of this, is I can now begin to control those based on the color and the series. So let's go ahead and soda, I type in 300, and yet another series will show up in a different color. Okay? Now, I don't want to type these in manually because that defeats the purpose of conditional formatting. I actually want to use a rule to define the color for these. So the rule, I'll type that out here. We're going to start in this first cell. We're going to use an if function, and then we're going to include in that an and function. And the way the and function works is everything inside the and has to be true for the and function to return true. If the and function returns true, then the if function will basically be true and apply its settings. All right? I'll walk through this slowly, and then we can always revisit it if it doesn't sink in. Okay, so effectively what we want to do is to see, does our profit fall within this bin of 0 to 100? If it does, we're going to put the sales value in this cell. If it doesn't, we're just going to put a blank value in this cell. And then we're going to check, does 250 fall within 101 to 200, or 201 to 300, so on and so forth. We're going to use that all through the magic of formulas. This is actually a really powerful technique, because what I'm showing you here is conditional formatting for profitability and falling within certain bins. But you can also, say you just wanted to highlight the max and the min value in your chart. You could set up a formula that does exactly that, where basically it'd be a 3-series chart where the max is, let's say, green, the min is red, and all the rest are just blue. Okay? So there's a lot of flexibility in this, but let's walk through it. Okay, so we started with an if function, then included in that, that function an and now what we're going to do is check to see if profit is between 0 and 100. So I'm going to click on profit and see if profit is greater than D1. Now, I know that as I build this up, I'm going to want to fill down and then ultimately fill to the right. I know that my rows are not going to change, or I don't want them to change, so I'm going to make sure that that's an absolute reference by putting in a $sign. Okay, it's a critical piece to this step. Next argument that I'm going to put in is I'm going to check to see if profit is less than or equal to this value. And again, I know my row is not going to change, so I'm going to put in a $sign to make sure that that's an absolute reference. And that's basically my and statement. So effectively it's saying, is profit greater than 0 and less than 100? If that's true, then my if statement will be true. And so if this is true, then I want to put the sales value into that cell. So this will evaluate to sales if it's true. If it's not true, then I just want to put a blank value in that cell. So I'll just put empty quotes and then end my function. Okay? Now, if I type this all in correctly and hit return, it's going to fill down, and we're going to see numbers show up on my chart. And we'll keep our fingers crossed on that. So, yes, all right. Okay, so we've got our first column built out. Now we just want to fill to the right, and we're off to the races. So I'm going to select this guy and Control R to fill to the right, and now we have the beginnings of our conditionally formatted chart. But you look at this, like, there's some cleanup work we can do here. Let's actually make these $signs and reduce the precision a little bit, and let's clean up our chart so it actually looks a little bit more like a normal column chart. I'm going to double-click on the bar here, and you'll notice these items here called series overlap and series width. If I change the series overlap, I'll almost max that guy out, and I'll reduce the gap width. You can see that it starts to look more like a normal chart. I'll increase it a little bit. Okay? All right, now what we need is a legend on the chart so we can actually tell what the regions were, or the colors, what they mean. So let's go ahead and add a legend to the chart. Then we're going to put a label on that. Go to Shapes, and we'll call this Profit. Okay, so now we can begin to see where we have those differences in profitability for given products. If you don't like this color scheme, it is a little garish in some ways. We can make it a little bit more professional looking. We'll go to our color palettes here and change it to, let's say, a monochromatic color scheme. All right, so there you have it, a conditionally formatted chart that is bound to data So if the values ever change, so for example, if the profitability of chocolate ever changed to, let's say, 100, the color of that bar will change dynamically with the data. Okay, yes? Yeah, so the question is, can you center the bars over the labels? With a little bit more care of those gap widths and spacings, you can get that to be more centered. I just kind of quickly did it for demo purposes. Sure.
Could you do the same thing with profitability, except make the bar width wider based on profitability?
So essentially, can you control the bar width based on a cell value? Today, the answer is no, but in the future, when we allow you to control the actual properties of the chart through cell referencing, that will be possible. There's other techniques, though, that, for example, a Marimanco chart where you're controlling the widths. This technique won't apply for that, but there's other techniques that will, and I can talk to you afterwards about some of those. Other questions? Okay, let me wrap this up and then turn it over to Frank to show you some of the interesting aspects of Visio and Excel, those visualizations. All right, I'm going to jump right to the end here. All right, for those of you who haven't been to Excel User Voice, I encourage you to do so. This is a forum which we've set up to really try to listen to the feedback of customers. It's a great venue for people to put in your ideas. Now, a number of those ideas were expressed in this presentation today. Please go out there and put your ideas in. But the really neat thing about this is people can vote on those ideas. And so the one we talked about earlier, allowing you to change the min and max values based on a cell value, that's the #1 feature request right now. And that's one of the reasons why we're taking paying so much attention to it. So please go out to Excel User Voice, put your comments in, vote on the things that you care most about. Next thing is we're also starting to roll out training. There's some on-demand training right now. This particular one is all about Power Pivot and Power Query, but we're going to start to roll more of those things out in the near future. And if you're interested in having like tips and tricks like this, let us know, and we'd be happy to put those out on the web as well. There's a bunch of resources available to you. We have our Excel blog, which we pump out articles on a regular basis. We also have Excel help topics, and there's a wide variety of resources out on the internet. If you just simply search for Excel charting tips or Excel charting tutorials, you'll find a ton of these examples out there that are pretty straightforward. You can walk through step by step. Okay. There's a few more sessions coming up this afternoon. Encourage you to take advantage of those. There's some really great presentations, and I wanted to thank you for your time, and we've been taking questions throughout this. What I'm going to do is move off to the side and let Frank set up, and while he's doing that, please continue to ask questions along the way. And I'll have a whole bunch of these books afterwards. I can hand those out, okay? All right, it's all yours, Frank. Thank you. Yes?
In your chart, couldn't you have had, since there was only one bar per series, couldn't you have just made it a stacked chart so that they all, because wouldn't they all just stack on nothing?
You're talking about the conditional formatting example? So if you want a stacked column chart, you certainly could have done that and controlled the series in that manner. But I was actually trying to achieve the effect of vertical columns with a single value for each of those columns.
Right, but I guess what I was trying to understand is because you effectively, when you did the overlap, you had like 5 bars, but 4 of them weren't there, so you were making the width smaller and overlapping them so that they would have the appearance of.
Although it may not have been obvious, but there's a bar for every single label along the x-axis. I can show you afterwards.
But they're all 0 for one chunk.
Well, let's take this afterwards. I'll show you what I was doing there. Other questions? Yes, back.
Is there a way of color matching whatever colors you have on the bar chart? That you have the primary colors to the table to kind of highlight either the font or the fills to kind of make that connection?
Yeah, so the question is there a way to do color matching of the bars to that in the table? Is that right? So the color palette is based on the theme of the document, and so the chart should map to those colors in the table directly. So you should be able to find a blue that matches the blue of a table directly. If you want to do a custom color on the chart, that's a little bit of a different scenario.
I'm asking if, like, just the fill of the font, let's say the copy or something like that, you want to use red on the table?
Yep.
Just like the two visually with your presentation?
Yes, you should be able to achieve the linkage of the color on the table and like the call out that I showed before. Again, we can go offline and I can show you an example of that. All right, let me turn it over to Frank. He's going to talk about Visio and
Thank
some
you,
word
Scott.
process flow.
We're watching every one of you, or most of the guys and girls, go out of this room. I was feeling like singing that song, Please Don't Go. I'm begging you to stay. You know, it's like, hey, my audience is going away. All right, okay. I have just five or 7 minutes to take you through this. We asked the question. We do a lot of visualization with data and charts and a lot of the cool Power BI stuff that you have. And we do that on maps and with charts, and you do that pretty well in Excel, and you know about that bit. We also have a parallel, big, real cool solution called Visio, in which you can do data visualizations using data and make it real time, right? So how do you visualize data on shapes, not just in the form of charts and whatever you've been seeing at the Data Insight session, and that's the reason why we are starting to introduce Visio, which is a product, into some of these BI sessions that we're holding to show you two worlds of drawing data insights or representing data. One in the world of charts and Excel and what you know, and in the other world of shapes. So, when you use shapes and you're charting out processes and whatever else, how do you tie it up to data? So that's what I'm going to take you through today. All of you know, at some point in time, would be involved in a process or would need to draw out formats, flow plans, engineering plans, whatever the case may be. How do you tie that up to data to show statuses of what's happening behind the scenes for that equipment or that flow plan or statuses on the process, bottlenecks on the process, right? So here's something that I have in a chart that you'd see, and you'll notice that this is a cross-functional flow chart. It's a standard. I've opened up Visio. I could go and open up new files. Please don't die on me. You know, this is Murphy working its way through my presentation. There you go. Now, if you notice, this is what I mean by shapes, network diagrams, and whatever else you'd want to put in. And you have thousands of these templates that you could automatically open up and start creating your shapes. Let's assume I had a blank one or what I currently have. I could then go in and use stencils and search for more shapes, right? I could also search for a shape and say, give me a shape to do with, let's say, business process notation. Then I could just simply go and drag shapes on my screen, right? Now, this is how you add shapes. We've added a cross-functional flowchart, and you notice that the ribbon comes up for that cross-functional set of properties or shapes that you want. I have the stencils right over here on the left-hand side, and we've gone ahead and drawn the process. I've connected my shapes, etc., to each step. Associated with each step is a completion percentage. So let me take you back to my folder here, and this was my Visio file. I have an associated Excel file which has the steps which are named in similar fashion on the process flow. And I have data sitting over here, and this is what Scott showed you a little earlier. How do I now make that process flow living and breathing along with the data that I have, right? So here's how simple it is with Visio. In Visio 2016, it senses the columns that you have to identify unique, to draw a unique identifier between the data and the Visio shape. In this case, it's the name of the shape. Here's what we do. We go into data. I've not done anything. I just go into data. I haven't selected anything. I need a quick import. I'm saying, hey, go and bring me data in from a file and sense if it matches the shapes on my Visio file, and then attach them and put some indicators telling me what's the status of each process from a completion percentage and if this step has been assigned to anyone or not, right? So I do a quick import. It says, show me your Excel workbook. I go in. I'm just doing this to show you how simple it is. And that's the reason I haven't canned the whole thing. I have product launch status over here. So I go and choose that file, and I say done. And notice what's happening now. What Visio does is it goes and does its own search. It imports rows, it identifies, tries to draw linkages, and then says, OK, we've done most of this for you. We found the data in the matching bit. And you suddenly see this now alive with data coming in from your data source. And when I've used Excel for simplicity's sake, you can go in and open any ODBC compliant data source. So you now are open to a whole world of data that you can connect to with normal standards, right? And if you notice here, I have this data linked to shapes. I can double click on a particular shape, and the focus will shift over there. This is what it found out and assigned as data graphics. So this is how I could really actually go and take out and assign for a particular set of shapes. I could just select the shapes here. Let me just zoom in a bit. I could just go in and select these shapes and say, hey, take out the sign field indicator or the complete percentage indicator, take that out. I could even go and start working on defining different kinds of graphics now if I needed to by actually going in, and I could right mouse here, and if you look at this, it says data, and I can go and edit the data graphics and go into putting in a lot more of different kinds of indicators. Look at this here. There are a number of indicators and representation bars and stuff that you could put in that will really help you represent the statuses of your data. More importantly, if I go to that Excel file, and we notice here that this step, provide internal download packages, sitting at 50, I could go and change that, and that's here. Let me just click in away. This is the area it is in, 50. I can go and change that to 100. And Murphy is going to go to sleep, hopefully. I save it. And my magic works. All I've got to go and do is say data, refresh. And it asks me what data I could set it up to automatically refresh. I say, yeah, refresh all. And there you go. And that's changed to 100. So what happens is, now here's something even more sweet. Let me show you something else before I take you to the world of how you send it out to other people. Let's look at something else that we have. I have a dashboard and a manufacturing process and an assembly line that's all being tied up to my country status, right? Look at this here. I have a countrywide representation of the statuses of my manufacturing plants, right? So let me go here and say presentation mode. Now this is from a Visio file sitting at the back end. I opened it up right in front of you. And I have a link here. If I click on this, what is it going to do? I'm saying, hey, there's a flag that says red over here. I want to go and inspect the assembly line sitting behind it. And here's the assembly line that's linked also to data that might be coming in from different systems. And I now see the various indicators of what point is red or green. And this is mapping to data that I'd want to track in visual format on my equipment, on shapes. So your shapes relate to equipment on an assembly line, and that equipment, you have performance statistics that you're putting up as indicators, right? So right now what you see is, through Visio, I can now start showing up different formats and fashions of equipment, processes related to data. In your organizations, when you use O365, how do you suddenly make this Visio file available to people who don't have Visio? You go up and put it in SharePoint. Put it up in SharePoint. SharePoint has a out-of-the-box Visio viewer for itself. And look at what I'm going to open up over here. There is a free guided tour, testdrive.visio.com. This is super cool. I'd advise you to go and see this. It's really cool because you can go in over here and you will actually see this is SharePoint on the left-hand side. This is your Visio web part. You got to post a Visio file in your shared directory, put in the web part associated to the file, and your Visio file can be consumed by all users as read-only and interactable and refreshable. They will not be able to make changes to it, but you suddenly opened up the world of sharing processes and data and intelligence on shapes, on files such as this, with users that might not even have Visio. Here you go. And go and click through this, and you'll actually go and see, it'll take you through what's happening on these Visio files. And it's as simple as the file that I showed you at the back end, which is sitting right here. and I have my data sitting in Excel files, right? And it just gets even sweeter. You can do HR charts, organization charts, timelines, mind maps. There are thousands of templates and shapes and formats that you can use to represent your processes, your information, and tie them up to data, most importantly. I'm done.